Okay. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is the July 11th, 2024 meeting of the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee of the Vermont Climate Council. Rich, you want to kick us off with the logistics?
Thank you, Melissa. Do we have a volunteer to take notes of today's meeting? We'd like to rotate this around someone who hasn't done it yet. I'm among those who have not done it, but I think it's unwise to volunteer to do that while I'm also in the chair.
I've done them twice, but I can do them again if you would like.
Well, we should make a list and recruit some volunteers for going forward. Anybody else?
I'm happy to do it right now. My computer's in the shop and I can't possibly do it on my phone. I was supposed to have it fixed today, but
I can do it again.
I can't get the Hardwick.
I'll do it. I'm one behind.
Okay,
Christine.
Liz. Thank you, Liz. You're on, and
No worries.
Christine,
I can do it. Sign me up for next time.
All right. Thank you very much. I was not present at the in the June meeting, but I'm happy to open the item. Anybody have comments to make about the minutes posted for the June meeting? Corrections that are needed, etc. Christine?
Adam might have noticed this, but he's listed, Adam Sherman is listed as a state agency representative, if I read it correctly. And I think Adam is representing the EIC.
That is correct.
Good catch.
My apologies to Adam.
Any other comments? If there are no other corrections, we'll deem the minutes to be approved. We have two discussion items and then reporting items. The discussion items are to discuss the findings from the Climate Action Plan update kickoff meetings and to discuss best practices for recording hearing and recording and responding to public comments received at subcommittee meetings. I would appreciate hearing from someone who attended the kickoff meetings to talk about what went on in the kickoff meetings and what issues were particularly salient to the work of this committee.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. I know several of us attended the meetings. I was at the second meeting, but anyone want to start off who attended I think it was the Tuesday evening meeting? Provide any comments?
Sure.
I was at the, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Christine.
I believe I was at the first one. I don't recall that it was a Tuesday, but I'm pretty sure it was the first one. I thought that Jane especially did a very good job explaining how the cap came about and its relevance. I think a clear takeaway that I have the belief was followed up on, that not enough time was left for public comment. And I'm quite confident that that was thought about and addressed in the future meetings. That was my main takeaway from that. I think we got into almost 90 minutes before it was turned over to the public. So, but that was duly noted and I'm quite sure recognized. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's my main recollection of it.
I was at that first one, and I have to agree with you, Christine, that there just was not, there was so much information delivered, and it was good. It was at a high level for us, but it was also very detailed for the general public. And there were advocates there who had specific things they wanted to talk about, which is fine, but you just getting input that's not particular to one advocacy organization I found was discouraging, particularly in the breakout groups. I don't know if that could be fixed with questions posed to the group as opposed to just leaving it wide open. I don't know.
So just a question, the breakout groups were just given free rein to discuss a topic area and that was it? They weren't,
Well,
there wasn't a
no.
guided.
We had a presentation in my group. Joey gave the presentation. Christine, I think you were there too. And there was an overview which went on too long, in my opinion.
Right.
And then, if my memory serves me right, 75% was about biomass. Of the conversation was about biomass, and nothing else. Which is, it's obviously but being the transportation, I'm eager to hear about transportation. It hardly came up, if it did at all. I didn't think the minutes really reflected that conversation. The summary reflected that conversation. But I know there was another meeting, and maybe that breakout group had more input in other areas. So, and I don't hold it against the biomass advocates, but they were there, and that's what we talked about, which is an important message, I guess, if that's what people want to talk about. As opposed to lots of other things. So that's my.
There were others. Thanks, Gina. There were others who had comments. Christine, Bram.
I was also at the first meeting, and I think what everyone else has said is accurate. We, myself included, as one of the presenters, talked too much, which did not give us enough time for listening. Yeah, as I looked over the summary of the feedback, a lot of stuff that I think we all agree on. We did hear quite a bit about non-car transportation solutions. We are pretty focused on cars, and a lot of the public is interested in other things. Public transit, light rail, walkable, bikeable, all those things. And looking through the summary of the feedback, biomass is probably the most sensitive issue. I think, like, reading through it, I'm like, yeah, we all agree on all this stuff except what we do about biomass. So we're going to have to grapple with that. And it'll be fun. People will get upset, but it'll be fun. We'll sort it out.
Okay. Any other comments about those meetings? Later in our discussion, I think it would be good for this committee to start making a list of people we'd like to invite specifically to address the committee, or issues that we especially want to address by inviting people generally to address the committee. If, as we go through the process of amending the plan. So just keeping in mind what members of the public are most interested in either learning about or commenting on, and hopefully both. It's going to be important to tailoring the use of our time. Shall we move on to the next topic about integrating public comment into our committee meetings? Is there someone here who was involved in developing that set of recommendations? Or is there someone who would care to summarize them?
I can take that one, Rich. I think this came out of the Just Transition Subcommittee, and since we don't have our liaisons here today, there's no one, I guess, to speak directly to this guidance. And again, apologies for getting these materials out a little bit slowly this week, but hopefully folks had a chance to read this best practices draft document that was circulated. And for those who attended the Climate Council meeting on Monday, this was presented to the full committee. Best practices, again, recommendations from Just Transitions on how we address and incorporate public comment, both during our meetings and in our work formulating recommendations. And the subcommittee, I'm sorry, the Climate Council, I think decided to approve this in spirit with some minor modifications to the document. So I think we will see a final version shortly, but again, we're not going to go through the document in detail, but really, I think the key highlights for our subcommittee are continuing to kind of review the outputs that the Climate Action Office and CBI, Consensus Building Institute, are generating and sharing with the council broadly as they continue their public engagement work in the spirit of updating the climate action plan. So we're getting quarterly reports. I think folks are probably receiving those. There's also the report after the initial climate action plan. So the public engagement findings from 2021 are a good resource for all of us to review as well. And then the Climate Action Office, as I said, is taking ongoing public comment in the CAP update, and Sophie is committed to sharing that with subcommittees in kind of real time as they get public comment that touches on the work of the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee. They'll be sharing that with us. I think you all probably saw an email from Sophie, I think that just came today on the recommendations specifically coming out of those public meetings that we were just speaking about. So again, just it's incumbent on us to be incorporating this input that we're getting, what we're hearing from Vermonters, and thinking that through and incorporating that into the recommendations that are coming out of the subcommittee. I think that's the first task here for us, and really demonstrating that our recommendations take into account this public input. The second piece of the guidance document is really kind of in our meetings, how do we handle public comment? And there were some recommendations there. Specifically, the thing the council talked the most about on Monday was this recommendation that public input shouldn't always be put at the end of our meetings. So if the subcommittee is having substantive conversation, there should be an opportunity for us to have public input once information is presented, but before there is subcommittee discussion, specifically subcommittee discussion that's going to lead to a decision, right? So that we're not taking public comment necessarily at the end. So I think I'll stop there with a summary. Well, I think one other point that we may touch on at the end of this meeting is both in the climate action plan kickoff meetings and again in this best practices document, there is this consideration for in-person meetings too. And I think that's there are a lot of pros and cons to having in-person meetings versus virtual meetings, but it is something that both the council and the subcommittees are going to need to grapple with in terms of accessibility and discussion forums and reaching the public. So that's one more thing I would just flag for us for kind of future consideration. I think there is going to be some appetite to have in-person meetings in the fall, perhaps. So wondered if, folks did get a chance to review this, any thoughts or concerns about implementing these best practices at the subcommittee level, or just kind of any other thoughts on these recommended best practices from Just Transitions.
Melissa, I don't think it's a different comment. It's just an emphasis that at the meeting we just had, there was an agreement that we start using this immediately, even though we'll get a final. You had said we'll get a final, but the idea is do it now. So just to be clear.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Liz. And we did put public comment on our agenda twice for today, just to make sure folks have an opportunity to weigh in early and often.
Yeah, it seemed to me that the most substantive and really positive aspect of the aside from the general opening to hearing from and listening to and responding to the public was this recommendation to take public comment after substantive information is presented, but before the committee gets into real deliberations. There might be some initial committee discussion or Q&A about the substance, but that hearing what members of the public have to say about it before we really get into deliberation seems to me to be a procedural improvement that we can try to follow. And then finally, I think, we're probably all going to realize that time is limited and we have an obligation to actually create a plan. So there's going to be it will be needed, as the document points out, that we have to set some time limits on the amount of time that we can devote to pure listening and answering questions from members of the public. And that's going to be, I think it'll end up being an important procedure to sort of set limits and make sure that we hear from as many people as possible. Any other comments on this part of it?
I'll just note if others don't have comments, one thing that I found maybe surprising and could be a challenge for the subcommittee is the encouragement to respond directly to public comment. And I don't, in my limited time with the Climate Council and the subcommittees, I don't think that's something that's typically done. We really kind of accept and document public comment, but don't necessarily engage during that time. So I would just, flag that again as something that was potentially a change, which is if someone raises a concern or discusses a different viewpoint, really to engage in and address where the subcommittee is at with that. So a more interactive public comment than maybe what we're used to.
Melissa, does that mean in person during the meeting, or does that, because that could be very difficult to manage, or is that in follow-up? And if it is follow-up, there's a ton of work associated with that.
Yeah, really good
I mean,
point.
I can't envision how that would work.
Yeah, and this wasn't discussed at the council meeting.
Practically.
No, understood. The guidance in the document is respond directly to public comments, specifically addressing comments during discussion, which to me meant in real time. But again, we didn't really touch on this at the full council meeting. I don't know if others have a different viewpoint.
Yeah, no, that was my understanding as well, that if someone says, hey, what are you guys doing about public transportation? That we have that conversation, and you're right, it will be a challenge to manage the time, but there's some things that can be answered pretty quickly, and probably other things to which it's appropriate.
They can't be answered quickly.
We don't have, that requires a more involved discussion, and we will follow up with more information afterwards.
So it'll be incumbent on the chairs to manage that conversation. So we're not, because we could get sidetracked, rightfully or wrongfully, on any number of issues. From transportation planning writ large to biomass, to the health of the ecosystem. I mean, you name the issue, the important issue. So as long as the chairs are ready to manage that, and we have the information at our fingertips, we develop talking points or information sheets to help with that.
Yeah, and there's a difference between having a transparent discussion among counselors as to the pros and cons of an issue and why we're deciding what we're deciding, which is a form of explaining to members of the public why we're doing what we're doing, which seems to be is both called for and appropriate. There's a difference between that and engaging in a form of dialogue and debate with any number of members of the public who, would like to spend a lot of the committee's time debating a particular point. And you're right, that has to be managed in a public meeting in order for the meeting to accomplish its basic purposes. Liz?
Yeah, what you said, Richard, and then the other thing I wanted to mention is when Sophie sent those documents earlier today, I had just a brief chance to look at them. Probably all of you either have or will, but in particular, the cross-sector breakout notes do have specific recs. And so it might be a smart thing just for the task groups that we're going to have later. I know for electricity, we met yesterday, you'll hear about it later. We should probably build some time into those task groups to specifically open these notes and make sure that we've had a chance to consider the ones that fit each task group in order to, make the whole process better.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, I had circled a few of them myself, thinking that they would likely come up anyway, but if they don't, we should make sure we touch on them. Any more comments on these procedural and practice items? Okay. Item number 4 on the agenda is to respond to a request from the Climate Action Office, but it really should be our own request to ourselves. What input from Vermonters would be meaningful and actionable to you as you work on the action plan update? And what is it that you think we should, in particular, hear from either? Well, anyway, I'll leave that broad. It's a variety of ways to answer that question. Liz?
I wanted to tack on a question either to all of you or back to the CAO as needed, which is when and how as well. Just a preview, it came up in our task group meeting yesterday that at what level are we intending to get further public feedback? The task group level will be pretty hard, pretty detailed, and not as easy to kind of widely broadcast and receive comment. So in addition to what input would be meaningful to us, it would be helpful, I know for our task group and probably for others, to understand just process-wise when and how we receive that feedback too. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. Gina?
There's two things. One has just come up today. I mean, we're having a climate emergency here in my corner of the Northeast Kingdom. And the Climate Council needs to acknowledge that and alert people that there's important work being done, because I don't think people on the ground understand that. And that's more of a communications thing than it is a survey question. So I'm sort of delving off. I would have liked to have started this meeting by acknowledging what's going on. This is a year later, and many, many communities are at it again. And this is horrible. And the Climate Council is in the middle of this to solve the problem. And that needs to be recognized, and there should be some kind of communication strategy around that for the council. So I'm off track on that. Specific to transportation and the questions we want, that our working group met this week, and we wanted to have some questions ready, but they're not. Essentially, we like people to understand the context of transportation. We're getting lots of feedback about alternative modes and transit and bike ped and how great that is for communities. But we know from the work that VTrans did and others, it's not going to get us there in terms of emissions. So we want, how do we break this news to the public that we really need electrification first and foremost? We talked about this for years, because unless we're going to really get into these co-benefits and they're going to go into the weighing of the climate action plan, which if it is, I don't know how that's going to work. We need to ask questions that have some context around them vis-a-vis alternative modes that alert the public to, yeah, this is great, but here's what we need to do to reduce emissions from the transportation sector, which is primarily electrification. Is that too vague? I mean, I don't
No,
have the words. But
You know,
we need-
it wasn't, but let me translate that into an answer to the question that was raised, which I think you did answer the question. I mean, what I heard you say is that you would like to hear from Vermonters how they would address the emission reduction mandate and challenge and moral obligation in the transportation sector. And that requires sharing some understanding about where the tons are. And
Right.
and then, you know, I would like to hear what people have to say about that.
I mean, people
and
can be
there's-
seduced into believing that if we have more transit, emissions will go down. And as long as somebody else takes the bus besides me, you know, I mean, there are really, really, really good reasons to have more transit. But reducing emissions right now is not one of them. So how do we it's an education thing, or because we can ask the question and they're going to say, and we hear it over and over again, you need to be able to ride your bike more safely, you need to have better transit. And we're going to keep hearing that. And then at the end of the day, we're going to have to say to everyone, well, sorry, studies tell us, data tells us that's not going to work. Do we just continue that? Or do we try to better educate people, or is that us sort of pushing stuff down people's throat if they believe that if somebody else takes the bus, then the problem will be solved?
No, I think you're raising a really good point. And this is like the crux of public engagement, right, Gina? Like, how do we do that public engagement? And then how do you do education at the same time, right? A survey is different than a focus group where you can sit down. I mean, the department did some of this work around like deliberative polling, and then do people's positions change if they're given a little bit more information, which is what you're talking
Exactly.
about. Once
Exactly.
I'm equipped with the data that says, okay, public transit has a ton of co-benefits and it's not going to get us to GWSA compliance. How does that impact your thinking and your positions? And
Yes,
that's resource intensive, but yeah, go ahead.
It's framing some information around those questions, and how that information is delivered. I'm not sure about, because I'm not that much of an expert on surveys that you are, Melissa, but what you said really rings true to me. It's giving some context to these questions to help people better understand what's going on.
And that's probably the extent of my knowledge on engagement and surveys, but I do think we can tap into CBI and Sophie at the Climate Action Office and get a little bit more on this. You know, if we want to look specifically at transportation, what's the strategy to get the input that we need that will be actionable for us?
Thanks, that's great.
Well, it's actually, Melissa, I've long been a fan of deliberative polling for the reasons stated. And I'm wondering if the department, or if you are aware of other state agencies who are interested in doing that in relation to development of the action plan. Anybody aware of that?
Oh,
Go ahead, Andrea. Yeah, on the transportation
No,
side.
that's okay. I think I misunderstood the question. I am not aware of that.
Yeah, I think that would fit in the Climate Action Office, Rich. I mean, we certainly did. The department did a significant effort around the renewable energy standard in this space. I don't think we have anything planned for, say, the thermal sector, the transportation sector. But I think there is, you know, if you're talking about resources in terms of staffing versus resources in terms of money, I think we could probably money, if not people to do the work. And again, I think we'd want to check with the Climate Action Office, because I know they're kind of leading on public engagement.
All right. Well, that's a question that we can ask the Climate Action Office. It's recognizing the challenge that Gina posed, but I think the same challenge comes up in numerous contexts for us. The challenge between co-benefits and nice to have versus real mitigation progress and have to have in order to meet the mandates. Jared?
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, I really appreciate this discussion. And one reason is because I think it's really highlighting a tension and a balance we need to achieve, which is, when I think about the responsibility that we were given, that we're required to meet by the Global Warming Solutions Act, it really comes back to, there's multiple sections, but I'm going to just paste in the chat one that I always come back to, which is 592B, and it says, our primary responsibility as a climate council is to create and then revise and update the climate action plan. And the law is really clear that the plan shall set forth the specific initiatives, programs, and strategies, including regulatory and legislative changes necessary to achieve the state's greenhouse gas emissions reduction requirements, and to build resilience to prepare the state's communities, infrastructure, and economy to adapt to the current and anticipated effects of climate change. And so to me, that really narrows our responsibility. I think a lot of the public engagement has been, what do you think about climate change? How is climate change affecting you? And at the end of the day, our responsibility is to make very specific recommendations to the legislature around rulemaking that can achieve what was laid out in the Solutions Act. And, I think that there needs to be a greater degree of either context setting or of rigor and back and forth in these conversations to make them real. We're not at a point now where we can just say, oh yeah, wouldn't rail be nice? Any kind of rigorous, careful study shows that rail in Vermont's context, whether it's passenger rail or light rail, is not cost effective. And the law lays out really clearly that cost effectiveness and equity and emissions, these are the key criteria we need to be following. And so I think we also have a responsibility to make sure that the public understands that the criteria that we were given to work with, which include cost effectiveness, which should drive the transportation considerations as well as others, and they include equity, and they include meeting these other requirements. And I feel like right now, the conversation around public engagement is really detached from that. It's kind of high level, amorphous. And at the end of the day, our responsibility is to be much more specific and in line with our legal responsibilities as laid out in the Solutions Act.
Thanks, Jared. Further comments on how to answer this question? What input from Vermonters? Frankly, one thing that I would say back to the Climate Action Office, which you all have just commented on, is what we would like to hear from Vermonters is informed discussion, perhaps through deliberative polling, on ways to meet the statutory requirements set out in the Solutions Act. As focused, as Jared just said, are there more specific items? We could probably, as we talk about individual action categories, we can then ask ourselves, what information would we want to get from Vermonters about priorities that they hold in, that they would advise us to take. Anything further? Oh, and also, I think this is in response to Gina's question. My interpretation of the public engagement process is that it is focused at the subcommittee level and at the council, not at the task group level. The task groups are internal working groups among ourselves to help just divide up the work of the committee. But the task groups are not decision-making bodies. They are akin to staff for the full committee, and they're going to be helping the full committee to make its decisions, and that's where we want to focus public input. I'm seeing heads nodding there, so maybe that's something that we should try to remain clear on. All right, now while we're at it, this is a good time for opening up this meeting to public comment. Are there any members of the public participating in this meeting who'd like to address the committee, particularly on the topics that we've already covered? Okay, I don't see any hands raised, and if someone is monitoring this call and wants to send in a note or raise a hand, please let us know. All right, let's turn to task group updates, beginning with buildings and thermal task group. Where are you? What priorities have you identified, et cetera? And Gina, I think you, or Christine, you are ready to rock and roll.
Yes, thank you. Nice to see everyone again. Good afternoon. The building/thermal task group is underway. We have had 4 meetings since I think the last cross-sector mitigation subcommittee meeting. Just as a reminder, I'm just speaking on behalf of the group. The group includes Adam Sherman, Brian Woods, Jared Duval, Sam Lash, David Farnsworth, and Ben Belaski is joining us starting at our next meeting on Monday. And Melissa Bailey has offered to sit in when schedules align. And we certainly understand how busy everyone is. So we're delighted to have an expanded group this time around. We started our work grounding ourselves in the 2021 CAP and the 2 pathways, 5 strategies, and 9 actions that are and in the 21 CAP for the building/thermal sector. And some of us were involved with that process last time, and some of us weren't. And yeah, Jared, go ahead and post the new pathways. Great, thank you. We've grounded ourselves in the pathways, strategies, and actions definitions that took a while to settle on during the last planning process, and it is a huge gift, in my humble opinion, to this time's planning process to already have that framework in place and to be able to work with and from it. And we each come to these roles from different planning and strategizing and action development backgrounds. So we've spent some time grounding ourselves and getting comfortable with what it looks like to think and apply our work in the pathway, strategies, and actions framework. We have allocated among ourselves responsibility for doing some research to get up to date on what has or has not happened with each of the pathways or strategies or actions from last time. We're partway through that work, and we're beginning the process of reporting back to each other what we're learning, so that anything that happened before, that was recommended before, we're clear on the major progress that's made on it, and therefore that informs our thinking moving forward on what to recommend for potential adjustments to former pathways, strategies, or actions, and or will help inform our thinking for potential new updated pathway, strategies, or actions. We have reminded ourselves that we are simply doing due diligence on behalf of cross-sector, that we are not a decision-making body, that cross-sector will at some point receive our suggestions and deliberate over them. And then we're also mindful that it then goes, whatever comes out of cross-sector goes to the Climate Council. So we know that we're not decision makers, but we're trying to carry out our role as volunteer staff as best we can. Jared has posted in the chat for what we're calling updated pathways that were informed by thoughtful discussion of the previous two pathways and informed by our team thus far best thinking of 4 potential pathways for the thermal sector moving forward. We have not reached final agreement on the exact wording of every one of them yet. I think we'll achieve that at our 5th meeting, hopefully on Monday, although I probably shouldn't predict the future on behalf of others. The pathways do not, in our opinion, represent any major new area of focus that wasn't considered previously in the CAP, but rather revising and updating our thinking on how to articulate major directional activity at the pathway level in the future CAP. And we weren't sure how much detail you wanted to get into, and for this first report in from the task group this time around. So let me pause and see if there are any questions that come to mind already, and or any direction that the co-chairs want to provide on whether you want to now, real time, talk through these 4 pathways or not, because I don't want to overhog time from the agenda if that's getting too deep compared to what you were expecting. And also, I would like to defer to Jared if he wants to add or adjust anything that I've shared so far, and recognize Ben is delightfully on the Zoom, and he'll be joining us for the first time next Monday.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. That was great. I would just offer that, I think we really wanted to make sure that the broad framework felt like it was inclusive enough to enable us to identify the strategies and actions comprehensively that could, meet our obligations and goals. And it really felt when we looked back at the previous 2 pathways that they were focused on kind of buildings, building shells, weatherization, and then fuels and their carbon intensity and the emissions of fuels. But there was this missing piece in between around equipment and what can be done with regard to performance standards on the equipment that is in buildings and uses fuels. So it felt like there was a missing pathway between buildings and fuels. So that's where you see updated pathway 2 around thermal equipment performance standards. And then, of course, I just, the minutes that we approved earlier said that, we agreed as a subcommittee that the workforce needs are such that it should really be called out as of elevated importance and strategy, and that is kind of a unifying pathway. I think we're open to, that's clearly a cross-cutting pathway. It's not just for the thermal sector, although it's especially true in the thermal sector. But we thought that initially, it made sense to call it out as its own pathway with importance. And before we got too far along with reviewing existing strategies and actions against the criteria and the public engagement feedback, we wanted to, at a high level, try to make sure that the pathway framework felt updated and expansive enough to be appropriate.
So in terms of feedback to the task group, that would be helpful now, especially helpful now or within, let's say, the next week. If there are 1 or more updated pathways that we are now considering as our close to final for our work before it gets passed back to you for your broader discussion and review formally, if there are any that clearly are, in 1 or more of your opinions, not headed in the right direction or not articulated in a way that is clear or makes sense or acceptable, and or obvious missing pathway or area of work that might be worthy of a pathway, we would welcome that feedback as early as possible, because absent that, we are now already, not across all pathways yet, but we are now already starting to dive into reviewing the past recommended strategies and actions and developing updated or new strategies and actions for consideration for the next CAP in order to achieve these pathways. So we're marching along.
Thanks, Christine. Liz?
So Liz, I see Liz. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go.
Sure, yeah, I'm trying to take notes and also ask a question, so I apologize if I missed this in your presentation. But looking at your proposed revised pathways, how, at least in brief, does the PUC's rulemaking on clean heat fit in? I believe it would be under pathway 3, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong on that, but I think so. And I ask because when I give the update in a second on electric, we had a little bit of a touch somewhat similarly on the res update, which is further along and obviously already law, not in rulemaking. But anyway, that was my question.
We do plan on assessing the progress to date with developing plans for the clean heat standard and reflecting on what could be effective new strategies or actions to consider in the CAP, but we have not done that work yet. Or at least if we have done it, I'm not aware of it. And that's not something I personally had volunteered to work on. So Jared or Jared might be more up to date on that than I am.
Yeah, I would just say, regarding your question of where it would fit in, Liz, in the initial CAP, it was it was nested under pathway 2, which was around reducing emissions from fuels. And since we added this middle one, which is now about equipment, I think you're right that in the revised CAP, recommendations related to the clean heat standard would be under the updated pathway 3. Although it could end up, it could touch on others as well. But in terms of like a consistency of where it was to where it would live in the revised plan update, that's my initial sense of where it would primarily be.
Great, thanks. Yeah, it's just since it's an active rulemaking with participants, obviously anything in the CAP update itself won't necessarily interplay with that process directly. So that's why I was wondering. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and I guess I would add that it's probably understood that there's an intersection between the structure of the clean heat standard, which credits and encourages equipment changeouts, and the new pathway 2 on equipment standards. I mean, those things can work synergistically if they're designed well.
And weatherization in pathway 1.
Yeah. Yes, same thing for weatherization and efficiency. Thank you. Yeah, and I would just draw the committee's attention to some words in pathway 4, which I think are quite useful, where it focuses on workforce, but also on the businesses and the business models that are needed in order to bring workforce, improvements to the real world. So paying attention to what we can do to encourage those businesses, to me, is like one of the goals of this pathway.
There's one other observation or comment I'd like to make. Brian and Sam, members of the task group, especially, were already aware, and others may have been as well, but just didn't happen to speak to it, with the CPRG Climate Pollution Reduction Grant application, if I've got the acronym right, that went into the US EPA on behalf of Vermont, and a whole host of measures that are laid out in that grant application, some of which are potential actions that could help implement various pathways and or strategies in the CAP. So we have, I should say not we, Brian and Sam have done a very good and fast moving job of going through the CPRG list of measures, is the word that I've seen in the language I've seen, that have Vermont's applied for funding from, and we are incorporating those into so far, we have incorporated those as potential actions under yet to be developed and finalized strategies in our work. So I'm not sure we haven't reviewed all that as a group yet, but my main point is just to say we are aware of and trying to bring in the work and activities of others and integrate them into our work for your consideration later, and we're trying not to carry out our work in a vacuum. Similarly, I met with the Weatherization Coalition this week to get up to date on their thinking and to share with them where we're headed and seek their input for our consideration into our work as well. So those are just a couple of examples of iterative work that we're doing to inform our thinking before we send it to you.
Thanks, Christine. I just noticed that Callie Fishburne who is a liaison to this committee from Just Transitions, has joined us, and want to invite her to say hello.
Hi, yes, sorry, I'm late. I had a meeting that ran long into this one. And excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. Hi everyone, my name is Callie Fishburne. I work at the Bennington County Regional Commission, live in Bennington, and was recently appointed to the Just Transition Subcommittee and made liaison to this committee. So this is my first cross-sector mitigation subcommittee meeting, and apologies for being late, and I will just be listening and learning today, so thanks.
Well, thank you for being here. Any further comments or discussion points with respect to the thermal pathways? We haven't, I mean, Christine said, well, maybe today isn't today to go down a layer or two into strategies and actions. But if anybody has comments on things that you'd like the task force to pay attention to, here's a chance.
I just want to say a quick thank you to Christine and Jared and the rest of the Buildings and Thermal Task Force. It sounds like a lot of work has gotten done in the last 4 weeks. So kudos to you all for undertaking that. And I think the framework you've laid out with the pathways generally makes sense. We'll probably have some, wordsmithing and discussion on that. And then just to kind of bring the focus back and the reminder that, what the council has specifically called out for cross-sector to focus on specifically, the equity component and the need to the extent that the recommendations and strategies we're beginning to formulate have impacts on low-income and vulnerable populations. What are the complementary actions to offset any negative impacts? And I just want to flag that again. We have a lot of guidance documents floating around. We need a library, but from the council to the subcommittees, that really was an area of focus. So just to flag that for all the task groups.
I just wanted to quickly chime in. I think it'll be interesting to see how the strategies and actions get built off of those, and sort of like my initial reaction was along the lines of like lumping and splitting and how much you split and where the strategies and actions kind of lie in those. So I think it'll be interesting to see how those get fleshed out more. And then just looking at your fourth pathway and thinking about the cross-cutting pathways and how that fits in. And I'm sure all the task groups will have something that relates to that and how those get fleshed out in the actions, and just making sure we coordinate those with the other subcommittees and other everybody else along the way. But that'll all work out as we go. It's impressive. Nice job.
All right, next up is the electricity task group.
This is the classic, like, why do I have to follow buildings and thermal? Because we have met and we started to organize our work, but it sounds like we're a couple meetings behind where you are. And so this will be a shorter update, although you are modeling very good task group behavior that will inform our work going forward. So far, our task group is me and TJ Poor and Peter Sterling and Sam Lash, who is on Just Transitions. welcome other members who may want to join. We've had an organizing meeting and a really good discussion. We have another meeting scheduled to assign kind of further, more specific tasks. And this will be a great model, like I said, for that. And we did go over, we had 3 pathways, just as a reminder, in the climate action plan related specifically to the electricity sector. And broadly speaking, without, all the details, one was on reduced emissions from the actual portfolio. One was on enabling electrification for Vermonters. And the last was on load management and grid transformation. Obviously in support of the other 2, really. And so we discussed high level that while one never just checks a box and says, oh, we're done, that the main action that was recommended for the first pathway, there was legislative action on, and a veto override with respect to the updated renewable energy standard, and largely growing out of the recommendations that the climate action plan had made, obviously with, different ways that could have gone, but the overall focus of that was clearly aligned with the first pathway. And so some discussion and update on that may be appropriate, but in terms of major action in that specific area on the actual generation portfolio itself, that's not likely to be a focus here. Instead, building on the other 2 pathways and thinking about other important mitigation that needs to happen, particularly in thermal and transportation, and how the electric sector and the electric grid can support that will really be the focus this time around. We talked about several things that overlap, so I'll just list them quickly and then we'll get into drafting as we meet further. Peter brought up and had some good initial ideas on what more we could say in this version of the climate action plan about the role of storage in helping to match supply and demand. And it was mentioned in the last climate action plan, of course, both in terms of supporting Vermonters' electrification through individual customer programs on storage, as well as the greater load management and grid transformation benefits that storage can bring as a tool. And so I think there is a broad agreement on the task group that that's an appropriate area to look at, and it's a matter of determining what sort of actions and language may be brought up to this committee to take a look at. Related to that, TJ and the rest of us certainly agreeing with him, talked about how this climate action plan can build further on the notion that without just having annual matching, but getting to a more granular level over time, our emissions with our portfolio and further work that could be done there. Relatedly, again, all of this is pretty related because it all supports further emissions in other sectors being reduced, further emissions reductions in other sectors. We talked about further work on the resilience and grid hardening side that it definitely crosses with Andrea, the rural resilience and adaptation work that committee is doing, and probably ag and ecosystems too, frankly. But making sure that we recognize the barriers that reliability can be for Vermonters to electrify and therefore reduce their emissions in other areas, as well as the benefits of grid transformation that can happen when those resiliency measures are put into place, both through load management as well as just better surviving events like we saw yesterday and last night, and unfortunately have seen many of in the past couple of years with increasing frequency. So Sam in particular brought that to our attention as a focus area, and we expect to do more on that. And then just in terms of enabling the electrification, making sure the updates are done on the many actions that have happened so far, some of the great success the state has had through the department, for example, getting the Solar for All funding into Vermont that will also enable storage. So making sure that all gets captured, and we haven't yet done that work, but we will be turning to it soon. And otherwise, I think that the 2 asks from the task group, one of which we talked about already, confirming that the public comment really comes to this committee level and further to the Climate Council. And the second one was just getting a little bit more granular feedback on when we need to have something closer to what the buildings and thermal task group already has, or even the more detailed? Is that end of August? Is it September? Like, what does that look like for the task group so that when we meet next, we can really lay out that timeline for ourselves? I will stop there if there are any comments, or, you know, Peter, who's here, obviously can add if I missed anything.
No, Liz, I think you covered all. I just want to say, I think we're a really cool task group. Like, we get along really well, and it was really a good short conversation, but we covered a lot of ground. So more people should join if they want. We're really fun.
Okay, you talked me into it. The question that Liz ended with was had to do with schedule. Wondering if any committee members have thoughts on that. Jared, maybe the steering committee has given thought to this, or
Yeah, there's the general timeline framework that was laid out in the guidance to subcommittees, and which Liz could speak to as well. But I think it's generally, I should pull it up before speaking off the cuff, but I think
It was like July-August maybe,
yeah,
but
I think it's,
but I wasn't sure how that fit with our actual subcommittee time, you know, this committee timing, and bluntly, July is not going to happen for us as a
Right.
as a task group. And August will be important for us to know, let's put it that way, if that is the real deadline, as opposed to early September.
Yeah, I do have the guidance open. I don't know if Jared, if you've pulled it up.
that's no, thanks, Melissa,
I
please do.
I think it does say that we'll be asked to give the council an update in September as a subcommittee. So I think I'm also equally concerned about the timeline. This is a very accelerated timeline, but it does sound like we should have general recommendations as a subcommittee after August to present at the council. But again, Jared, from the steering committee perspective, I don't know if there's, you know, if you see flexibility there or
Yeah, and
yeah.
one challenge is that we've talked generally about a September council meeting, but it's not actually on the schedule, and we don't have a date for it yet. So, you know, one thing that we should, I don't know if anybody is on from the Climate Action Office who's been able to dig a little bit more into that scheduling effort. I think it was something that Jane and David were going to follow up on, but maybe to be safe, you know, we work backwards from trying to be able to have initial draft pathways for each of the task groups, and to the extent possible, draft strategies and actions by the end of August, so that there could be a draft to share at the September. You know, and I think it's subject to additional information forthcoming. I mean, there's a lot. It's really like the ordering of this is difficult because, you know, we're supposed to get an updated greenhouse gas inventory sometime soon, hopefully within weeks. Originally, it was going to be June. You know, there is ongoing work with consultants around updating the pathways and the business as usual. And all that is really important context around the scale of the gap between what we're on pace for versus what our recommendations need to achieve to close that gap, at least in the emissions reduction obligation portion of things by 2030. And it looks, you know, there's different considerations around the kind of gaps and what need to be recommended elsewhere. But for this committee, primarily, you know, focused on cross-sector mitigation, I just think that we should do as much as possible to get some draft frameworks and recommendations, but recognize that additional data analysis is going to come forward that may need to that suggests we should be willing to have a more iterative process where those could be subject to revision depending on what we learn over the ensuing months.
That seems really fair, Jared. It brings to mind one other thing that came up in our small meeting yesterday that I do think is a committee level discussion. And we mentioned it earlier, Gina mentioned it earlier out of the public meetings. We should have a considered discussion and decision on where and how biomass will fit in. If a part of the task group, I'm sorry, the committee recommendations, or instead at another committee. That was flagged by us yesterday, although it's, not directly electric sector specific, given the emissions profile that the sector already has and the work that has been done and the recent res updates. It feels important to not forget to talk about that early.
I'm not going to respond on biomass. I put a pin in that, but I agree. Thanks for flagging it, Liz. Important. And I would say, just getting back to the logistics and the schedule, recognizing our meeting cadence, I'd say we have, cross sector has our August meeting on the 8th, I believe. And then, and I think we could use our September meeting as well in advance of any council meeting that might be scheduled in September. I would guess that would be after our September meeting. So really the meat of the August meeting will likely be kind of reviewing these pathways, that the task groups have been digging into, as well as the potential strategies and recommendations, and then coming back to September's meeting to kind of essentially finalize. And I'll put quotes because I agree with Jared that we need to be responsive and iterative there. But the September meeting, we will have to kind of develop our set of potential recommendations that we'll be bringing to the full council, even if they do get a meeting on the calendar for September.
Thanks, everybody.
Any questions for the electricity task group?
I would just add on the subject of biomass that A&R did find the money to commission an analysis of the implications of winding down biomass for electric generation. And I don't quite remember the timeline that's on, but I think we will have a fuller picture of all the questions that biomass raises in the next few months. Andrea, do you remember what timeline that's on?
No, I don't know.
Yeah. Maybe end of year when everything crashes together.
Everything's due.
All right, I do have one question. Thanks, Bram. A question generally for the test group. Are you at all inclined to look into rate design recommendations?
For what emissions reduction purpose? So I'm not, we didn't talk about it yesterday.
Yeah.
I guess if it's in
No, I'm
support
thinking of
pathway two.
I'm thinking of your conversation about BE and also demand response. The degree to which rate design would be, recommendations concerning rate design could be included in in the list of things you consider, or could not be there and sort of be implicit as implementing policy taken by the PUC.
Yeah, and I think that's how we handled it last time. There was a number of actions or statements under the second pathway that would be generally supported by different either offerings or specific rate designs. So yeah, especially if you're joining the task group, let's talk it through. It didn't come up yesterday.
Any further comments? Then we'll move on to transportation. Thank you. One general comment, we're talking about the constrained schedule and all this. Where we stand now compared with where we stood in preparing the first climate action plan, it seems to me that we are in far better shape in understanding the territory and the pathways, and I'm taking heart from the fact that it's hard and it's a short time frame, but we're really building on a lot of work already done. With that said, transportation.
I lost Gina. Gina, do you want to kick things off or you want me to just dive in?
Well, I'll say a few things. I'm going to echo what Liz says about thermal really setting a very high standard here. It's a hard act to follow. We did meet once a couple of days ago, and
We've met twice.
Oh, we did meet. How quickly time flies when you're having fun. Okay. We've met twice. Andrew has done a ton of work on a spreadsheet, which basically builds on the plan. Our pathways are very similar. We want to focus on money this time because the infrastructure, the electric charging infrastructure build out and the incentives programs, we have a good pot of money now, but we know that's not going to be there in the long run. And at least for the time we need to get electrification up and going. So we want to try to wrestle with that a little bit this time around. And of course, we have a major policy study going on around cap and trade and the transportation fuel standard. And unfortunately, that's not going to be ready until the first of the year, but that's all going to get factored in. And when you were talking about folks who we'd like to come to this committee and the council, the consultants on that project, I think will be very important because these recommendations are going to be significant. And the more background everybody has, the public and the council members in this committee, I think the better off we're going to be and the more intelligent conversations we're going to have. So that's something that, we hope will happen. But yeah, other than that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrea to walk through the nitty gritty of this giant spreadsheet.
Yeah, I don't know how nitty gritty we have to get, but
we don't need to be that nitty gritty.
Our group is Jared, myself. It's like the middle squares on my screen right now. Me, Jared, Gina, Joey, who couldn't be here, of course, Bram, and Deirdre, and that's it, right? That's all of us.
The fellow from the NEK.
Eric. Yeah, right. So yeah, we've met a couple of times. I think, we're kind of leaning on having a pretty good set of recommendations existing already. We don't see a huge amount of changes coming, except for filling that policy gap that we've been talking about all along. So of course we have some work moving forward on that in partnership with members of this subcommittee and, a contract that A&R and AOT are putting out. So that just got started yesterday, and we'll be starting to meet with our TAC group in the next couple of weeks. So again, a lot pending that analysis. We'll see where we can get with a recommendation. It'll probably have to be a pretty broad recommendation, depending on where we're at as this process unfolds and that analysis unfolds. So there's that. And then, for the existing, we just are using, Christine, I see you asked about the workbook, and you're talking about the progress report. Is that what you're referring to as the workbook?
No, it's not. I'm not referring to the progress report. Yeah.
Okay. Well, the workbook that we're working off of is the progress report. And just looking at that to understand if we want to make any changes and at what level, if it's a pathway strategy or action, and then identifying other areas that we want to look into. Gina mentioned sort of understanding a little bit more quantitatively where we're at with some of those actions and understanding, where we are in our EV charging for where we want to be and in our electric vehicle goals to meet the targets, to meet the requirements and the targets that were laid out in the pathways analysis. So we're kind of getting more data on that. We're looking at the funding sources that we have to understand the gaps that we see after we figure out where we are and what funding we have to move forward. If we'll need more funding, and so we can make more pointed recommendations around that and other capacity things. We're looking at the legislations that just passed that are related to the actions that we have, and we want to schedule, and we're identifying who we need to talk to and hear from for the implementers of this action. I know the council as a whole has made that recommendation that we really understand what the challenges are in moving forward, or making any progress, or making more progress, or making the progress that's required to meet the requirements of the GWSA. So identifying who to hear from. And so I think what we're planning on, the phase that we're in right now is sort of reviewing what exists and deciding what parts of that might need modification in the language or wholesale additions. Is it in the equity part? Is it in the workforce part? Do those need to be strengthened? And then using all of that data that we gather through that process to help prioritize, understanding that, you know, ultimately the goal is to come up with like a top 10 for all the recommendations, and how we get there, and, you know, sort of prioritizing our own actions more than just, you know, high, medium, and low even. What else? So I think, yeah, we're sort of in that gathering phase, in that analysis of what we want to do. Our goal would be to have some draft proposals for the August timeframe. We anticipate meeting a couple more times before our August meeting, and then having some draft, you know, conceptual, at least, maybe a little bit further along where thermal is, but yeah, by August timeframe, and then refining those in September, and by the end of September, having those prioritized is kind of the path that we're on.
Andrea, I wanted to VTrans's horn here. The carbon reduction strategy that VTrans did last year brings a critical data and information to the climate change plan. So we are going to make our discussion of the pathways much richer through the data that produced. So we'll have to do some work integrating that new information. I don't think it's going to radically change anything. It's just adds facts and data behind what we were generalizing in the initial round of pathways and strategies.
Questions, comments? So here's a thorny one. Do you all anticipate thinking about policies in the alternative? That is, we recommend X, but if X can't be done, we recommend Y as the next best thing.
That has not come up. We certainly, in the last meeting, talked about a host of issues around various policy actions and the challenges around those, from political to economic. And what you're suggesting, Rich, may have merit, but the group will need to mull that over. It sounds very interesting to me to have different scenarios built in.
And it sounds to me that most likely applies to our biggest task, which is finding a replacement for TCIP. And as I said, there is an analysis underway looking at the alternatives. There aren't a huge number of alternatives that will deliver the emissions reductions that we have to achieve. So I suspect that analysis will end with a recommendation, and but they're sort of three choices, and Maybe we end up and sort of explicitly decide that what we want to end up with is a prioritization. The best option is, for instance, joining New York's program. If we can't do that, the second best option is WCI. And if we can't do that, the third best option is a performance standard. These will all get us where we need to go. And we are not aware of any other ones that will, or something like that. Actually, I don't think that would be too hard based on the information we expect to get to put together.
Although maybe what Rich is saying, if you threw a ton of money at something, you might be able to get there. It would be a huge, huge number, and I don't know where the heck it's going to come from. But for instance, deploying, many, many more charging stations, or incentivizing many more purchases, buying your way out of the problem as opposed to a regulatory approach. And I don't even know if that would work, but that's something that, when Rich starts talking about alternatives, that goes through my head. I mean, it would be probably completely unrealistic.
Yeah, and that would probably get deprioritized based on the cost effectiveness criteria.
Yeah, that's true.
We have to judge all these things against.
Brad is right. We've tried everything we can here.
I was thinking more along the lines of Bram's answer.
Okay.
So, but
not the whole universe.
Maybe in some, but in some, how do you say it? Some of the more detailed strategies, there might be alternatives as well.
Okay. Got it.
Different ways to deploy charging stations. There where we think it should be done this way, but if that doesn't work, we could do it this other way. But no, just asking whether that was something that the test group had been considering. As Bram points out, there have been a lot of discussions along the lines that he just sketched.
Rich, what you just raised is a perfect thing to pose with the consultants, and that's why I think it's important. Here I am hardly reading the scope of services, but having consultants come in early to this group and having a conversation, an informative conversation about what they're doing and ideas that we might have that would be helpful to the council, I think would be a good thing to do. But
I see Jared's hand up, so I don't want to be rude, but I just want to say that scope of work is pretty prescriptive on how many times the TAC meets and how many times they come here. That's all based on they had to put a proposal together.
But they will come here. Come to this group.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And
the kinds of conversations the sorts of things that Rich is discussing, would that kind of thing be on the table, or would they just be coming in and saying, here's what we did and here's what we're doing next?
Yeah, we'll have further discussion about this at the TAC for sure, because they're putting their work plan together and getting into the details of the scenarios that they will analyze and to what level each of those scenarios will be analyzed before we say, let's go deep on this one or these or whatever that might be. But that's the way they're framing their work plan.
Well, maybe the council reps on your advisory committee then will have, the burden will be on them to bring our perspective to the process.
Right.
Which makes sense, I guess, as opposed to spending a lot of time briefing this group or the council.
Jared.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think there's a lot of wisdom in your suggestion, Rich, especially learning from our experience last time, where we had a lot riding on certain recommendations that when they weren't able to move forward due to forces beyond our control, there wasn't a clear way forward. I do think that whether or not there are kind of backup options explicitly listed among the strategies and actions depend on the type of strategies and actions. There are some that we have a lot more clarity around and are in our control. You look at the statutory language of the Global Warming Solutions Act and any rulemaking that is in the climate action plan directed to the Agency of Natural Resources to do, they have to do. And last time that was Advanced Clean Cars 2, Advanced Clean Trucks, and the heavy duty omnibus. And, you know, so but there are other recommendations to other agencies of state government, to the legislature, that those agencies may not move forward on, the legislature may not move forward on. And so backup options, I think, are, you know, wise and appropriate to consider, which could include rulemaking through ANR, since that is the main way that compliance is ensured in terms of the way that the Global Warming Solutions Act is written. Or it may include something else, but I think that, you know, something like TCI was the perfect storm because it was so dependent on other states. And that ended up being beyond our control. But I think that it's also relevant in, you know, beyond that. I think that this wisdom would apply to, you know, what happens if the clean heat standard does not move forward in a second vote of the legislature after the draft rules come back from the PUC, given that it is the single largest emissions reduction strategy in the climate action plan, and there's no plausible way that we meet our legal obligations without either that strategy or one that would achieve the same reductions. So I just wanted to pause to kind of think that through a little bit, but mostly just to appreciate and agree with the suggestion.
Any other comments on the report from Transportation Working Group? I kind of want to give you a good send off. You know, we know it's important. We know it's complicated. We know that you have a lot to do, and we're sending you forward with fond support.
I think we're towards the end of our agenda, and I don't think we have public folks on the phone, so I don't think we need to take time for a comment. But Rich, I don't know if you're watching the chat. There's some just this issue around how the task groups are structuring their recommendations and what we should be using to communicate and share those. Christine, you mentioned this spreadsheet that I think is the one that I shared with Buildings and Thermal, and Andrea mentioned in the transportation group, you guys are working on the CAP action tracking spreadsheet. I believe the spreadsheet that I sent Buildings and Thermal is kind of just a simplified version of that bigger workbook. Just because I found it a little bit unwieldy to work with the full version, but essentially, do we have a set template, which I think of course makes sense for all of the sub task groups to be using the same structure as they're formulating their pathways, strategies, and actions. And then if so, there have been some access issues. So I can't really speak to the access issues, but I know Brian Woods is working on that. Getting this posted, I believe, on SharePoint in a way that everybody can have access to modifying the workbook.
Yeah, and Sophie has reached out asking if some of us to test that. So I know they're working on it.
Oh, great. Okay.
She
Yes.
wanted some non-state people
Right.
to work on it. So
Andrea did some magic so we could all get in. I don't know what she did.
It's just my own SharePoint. That's all.
Oh, okay.
Don't tell the Agency of Digital Services. It's going to be okay.
I don't have those skills, Andrea.
So are Brian and Sophie potentially doing redundant work? And
I don't know, they can probably work together to figure that out, but I got something from Sophie yesterday with some instructions and promised that I would try it hopefully today and give her feedback.
Just for our general knowledge, is it the workbook that represents the work we did last time that we're now updating? Or is it a new empty workbook? Or do we not know yet? Okay.
I guess
I'm
I'm
not
unclear
responding.
about
Is that
there
Liz, what
being two
was?
workbooks. I'm confused on what.
Yeah, I
people
am
are
too.
talking about.
Sounds like we should take that back to Sophie as or, others as feedback that we need something specific. I know that our task group was working off of, first of all, the one that was already filled out, that we already had access to or whatever. But
Yeah.
then also that really long comprehensive document that the Climate Action Office and ANR had put together and we all looked at with the updates that at least give us something else to work off of. But we had not gotten Christine to the what does the new workbook look like part yet.
Just for what I shared with Buildings and Thermal was essentially including the existing recommendations, again, without some of the comments, the columns to the far right on status. But I did think, since our first task is are we modifying or deleting? It doesn't sound like anyone's talked about deleting any of the previous recommendations. I wanted us to all be working from the existing list.
No, I would
Andrea,
not.
that's what,
I
Andrea,
would
that's
not.
what we're doing, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, Christine. You're muted.
I apologize. I should have raised my hand and waited my turn. My bad. I would not assume that when all said and done, that there will not be old strategies or actions that are no longer relevant and are brought to life in a new or different way moving forward, based on what we've seen in our work so far. They're just things that made sense to think about in a certain way 4 years ago that don't still make sense to think about in the same way now. And trying to document that and why and how beyond the task group level, I don't envision being particularly helpful if we come up with a suite of suggested pathway strategies and actions that are coherent, informed on up-to-date research, and a thoughtful, logical way to think about what ought to be at least considered for 2025. That's how I've interpreted our assignment so far. So if a strategy or an action from the 21 cap disappeared, for example, in the thermal sector, I would be confident that if somebody wanted to know why it disappeared and isn't coming back verbatim or in any way at all as a suggestion for your consideration for 25, one of us on the task group will eventually be able to explain why. But I don't envision spending a lot of time packaging that all up in a really complicated spreadsheet, given that our job is to look forward. And you're relying on our knowledge and our expertise and our volunteer time and best professional judgment to help prepare you to consider what is our best thinking, as opposed to a spreadsheet cell-driven documentation of the logic that brought and all of our knowledge and experience and research that brought us to that judgment for your consideration. That's how I've been interpreting it so far. Given
Sure, so that all makes sense to me, Christine. So in terms of structure though, just blank spreadsheet versus we're starting from the 2021 cap and do what you need to do to modify that spreadsheet. We have archived versions elsewhere. We don't need to worry too much about if lines disappear. But I'd like to get to that place with all three subgroups again using the same format.
Yep, agreed, totally. No time like the present either.
Yeah, and I guess I would say that if there is any question about just the mechanics of doing that, Liz is working with Sophie on it. Christine, you should be involved to make sure it makes sense to you. And either Andrea or Gina should make sure that it works for transportation. And it just listening to this conversation, it seems to me that you're able, that this is going to happen, you're going to work it out. And your point person being Sophie at the moment.
Okay, I've been working for a week with Brian.
Brian. Well, Brian and Sophie need to be on the same page, obviously, and that's certainly possible.
And
yeah, I mean, Christine, was your question, what guidance can this subcommittee give to the task groups on this question? I just want to honor, because I know we've had some email exchanges over the past couple of weeks, so I don't want to be leaving you. So we do need to rely on Brian and Sophie to work through the technical access piece. But are we getting enough clarity for how the task group should move forward? If we essentially extend this spreadsheet that's been shared with buildings and thermal to the other groups, and work out the access issues, does that provide enough clarity for task groups?
We'll wait to hear back that this is the link we should be using. And can somebody just make sure, I don't know, it's my place to make sure Brian and Sophie are coordinating, because I don't happen to know if they are or they aren't. I've been
Brian's
off
on the
on,
call. Right? We're talking
Oh,
about
Brian's not,
Brian's
Brian's not here. He's not. He started the meeting and he's
Right.
dealing with,
Oh.
yeah, he's dealing with flood recovery. So I can take the action item, making
Thank
sure
you.
that the Climate Action Office is on the same page about what document we're using. And then I think Christine,
Thank
you
you.
have the other question about, can we add columns to the spreadsheet? Up for discussion, but my take would be yes, put in the information that's useful. We probably should, again, maintain consistency among the task groups, but there's no magic to the columns that aren't included in the version that I crafted.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Anything further for the committee today? Are there any members of the public who would like to address the committee at this time? I don't see anybody. Just making sure. All right, then. I think we have concluded our business. I appreciate very much everybody's time. Thank you for being here. Our next meeting is currently scheduled. Is this correct? For August 8th?
And
Yes,
then
it is currently scheduled. And I didn't know if we, I didn't hear any discussion about needing guest speakers or anything like that, but if so, we probably should get on lining those up sooner than later. Otherwise, it would be largely a working session, I think.
Yeah, I would say if anybody has thoughts about bringing in somebody to speak to the committee, please let Melissa and me know about it as soon as possible.
I think also knowing what's needed from the task groups for that meeting for good deliberation in advance would be really important. So we can have kind of consistent discussions around pathways and strategies. Do you want a draft of the strategies by then, or will we have more time? What is the expectation
Well,
for
what,
that meeting?
what do you think that I'll ask the test group leads, what do you think could be done? It makes sense to me to at least have a bold outline of what the principal strategies are. It's nice to identify pathways,
Yeah.
but the action is further down the line. And so I'm asking you all to confirm that it's possible to do that by the August meeting. The fundamental strategies, and to the extent that they can be reasonably supported or explained, that would be great too. Liz?
I think knowing it's due then is really good.
Yeah, that really
And then that makes it happen.
makes it happen, and I thank you for encouraging that.
Yeah,
Liz?
and I was gonna say, since you're now on our task group, we'll definitely get it done. No, but in all seriousness, we do have some vacation challenges, Rich, so we will do our best to get there. And I feel I can commit on behalf of the task group, at least having the newer version of what Building and Thermal presented today, for example, feels achievable. But whether we'll have time to organize and create higher level strategies underneath those pathways, I don't quite yet know, but it's very helpful to have that direction and aspiration.
Thanks, Liz. Jared?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think that it is a good target to set with the understanding that they're draft. and there may be revisions or additions that in the future. The other kind of takeaway that I can take from the meeting, if folks agree, I thought I heard this, it'd be good to affirm it rather than just assume it, is that given that we have a next cross-sector meeting after the August one on September 12th, that to the extent that, you know, Liz or I are asked as steering committee members in terms of input of scheduling the next climate council meeting, it sounds like it would be helpful to this subcommittee to try to have the next council meeting after September 12th. So we have two meetings between now and then to go through our draft pathway strategies and recommendations and get them ready for at least initial draft presentation to the council.
Agreed.
Okay.
Great discussion,
I
guys.
don't know why I can't find my raise my hand, but I can't. So I can
All
find
you have to
thumbs
do is
up.
this.
Okay, I got a real one. I just wanted to ask if we have a way, or if we did talk about it, I missed it, about how we're going to communicate back to the Climate Action Office about the stakeholder questions, or isn't that an expectation from them?
Yeah, I think we should get back to them, and thanks for raising it. Any volunteers? In the absence of volunteers, it probably falls to me and Melissa.
What's the deadline?
I
don't
don't
think
think there's a
it's-
deadline on the engagement. I mean, I think they are going to continue doing stakeholder engagement throughout the fall. There was a document that referenced like that individual subcommittees would have, I almost think it was like a specific public input session, but I'll have to look back. So I don't think we have a deadline, but I agree. Rich and I should touch base with Sophie, and circling back to the conversation we had early on about what level of engagement and potential focus groups or other methods beyond just questions. So we can take that as a follow-up and report back before the next meeting if there's something urgent, or certainly at the next meeting at the latest.
All right, thank you. So we'll leave that to Melissa and myself. Anything further? All right. Thanks, everybody, once again. I believe our business is concluded and we can stand adjourned.
Thank you, everybody.
Everyone. Bye.
So.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.